Hello, I'm David Myers from the UCLA History Department and Leve Center for Jewish Studies. On behalf of the Leve Center, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which features Professor Federica Francesconi from the State University of New York, University at Albany, and to highlight her recent work, Invisible Enlighteners, the Jewish Merchants of Modena from the Renaissance to the Emancipation. Her book is available through the University of Pennsylvania Press and wherever books are sold. And I'd like to add that this event is part of the Viterbi program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. And now I'd like to introduce our main act today, Professor Federica Francesconi, who is Associate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and Director of the Judaic Studies program at the University at Albany. Professor Francesconi teaches a broad variety of courses in Jewish history and cultures, European social history, women and gender studies, Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations, Israeli culture, and the history of Jewish art. Her research and publications address the social, religious, and cultural aspects of the early modern history of Jews in Italy, focusing on the multifaceted politics and dynamics of ghetto life. She has held fellowships in Israel, Europe, and the United States, and in fact, we remember her very fondly when she served as Viterbi visiting professor in Mediterranean Jewish Studies at UCLA. She's also been a fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. And before joining the faculty at Albany, she was assistant professor of history and chair in Judaic Studies at the College of Idaho. Today we will be discussing her new book, which I previously mentioned, entitled Invisible Enlighteners, the Jewish Merchants of Modena from the Renaissance to the Emancipation. This book was a finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Award, and particularly the JDC Herbert Katzke Award for writing based on archival material. She has also co-edited 2 volumes, From Catalonia to the Caribbean, The Sephardi Orbit from Medieval to Modern Times, and Jewish Women's History from Antiquity to the Present, the latter of which was also a finalist for a 2021 National Jewish Book Award. It's really a great pleasure to welcome back to UCLA, albeit virtually, Professor Federica Francesconi. Welcome to you, Federica.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the Leve Center for this opportunity. And definitely, it's such a pleasure to be back, even only virtually at UCLA.
Great. So this is the book we're going to be talking about, Invisible Enlighteners. And so let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us what this title is about? What's invisible, why invisible, and what do we mean by enlighteners?
Thank you, David. Thank you for the question, and that gives me the opportunity to open the main themes of the book. First of all, for those who are not convinced, like me, perhaps David as well now, that Italy is the center of the world, we are talking about Modena, the capital city in the early modern period of a northern Italian independent state run by the ruling family were the Estes, who basically had a long continuity of dynastic control of the area. This city in 1598 became the capital of the state, and Ferrara, that is a little bit more famous because of this echo of the Renaissance, was incorporated in the papal state. In my book, The Invisible Enlighteners are Modenese Jewish merchants who lived and prospered under the Este dukes during the 17th and 18th century, and they may be said to constitute the backbone of a wider history of early modern and ultimately European Jewish history. The book traces the settlement, ghettoization, and emancipation of these merchants and explore the means by which they establish a network of upper middle class Jewish families and maintains their roles as community leaders through business, interfamiliar alliances, and the production of religious and secular culture. So why they were invisible? Modernist Jewish merchants were basically the columns of the economy and even the culture in the state, and yet they were absent from the public discourse of the Estes. They were barely named in legal codes, while the Ghetto established in 1638 was quite visible. Interestingly also, that is the particular condition of Jews in Modena was that both entrepreneurs and small artisans or peddlers were all allowed to enroll in the city guilds, and their buildings were everywhere, as well as their stalls and their small shops. Yet, till the arrival of Napoleon in 1796, their presence in the public discourse was really kept under low profile and completely hidden in a way. While Enlighteners, because in addition to be culturally intermediaries between the Este Duchy and the capital city, Modena, and its authorities and upper middle class, with other international centers in the Mediterranean, Europe, and largely the Italian peninsula, were also enlighteners in the Jewish world. So these Jewish merchants raise basically created unique forms of Renaissance culture, a particular form of female agency, and Enlightenment practice that were unique in the European context for their importance.
So what you trace in the book from beginning to end is really the movement from invisible to a higher degree of visibility by the time we get to Napoleon. And if one were to read the subtitle of your book, From the Renaissance to the Emancipation, one might assume a tale of unbridled and ongoing progress. And yet what you show is that the path from Renaissance to emancipation was a more complicated one, a more jagged one, especially during the Counter-Reformation. I wonder if you could just, in general terms, sketch that path that is hinted at in your subtitle.
Yeah, David, absolutely. You are right. That was a complicated path. And what was characteristic, singular about this pattern was the longevity of these Jewish mercantile elite. They basically started to consolidate as an elite in 1598, when the city became the capital, and when also the Inquisition was brought to a full status, and more attention was brought on Jews who were basically left after the hunting of witches and the persecution of Christian heterodox movements, the most visible sign of impurity in the city. What though this mercantile elite was able to carry out in the 17th and 18th century was a complex, as you mentioned, a complex process of socio-cultural transformation and legal and political integration that evolved through these 2 centuries, 17th and 18th century, through a complex dialogue with Jewish identity without those suffering ruptures or dramatic divides that sometimes led to assimilation and conversion elsewhere. And absolutely, the moment in which in Modena and on these Jewish families that were consolidating themselves, facing the pressure of the Inquisition, we see there the politics of the Counter-Reformation. And in particular, Jewish lives were affected since the second half of the 16th century by a conversionary pressure initiated by Paul IV. This Pope also promulgated the Bull Communimis Absurdum that established the Ghetto in Rome, and ultimately was the text that justified also the creation of other and the establishment of other ghettos and local expulsions. Also, there was the promulgation of the Index of Prohibited Books in 1596 that definitely banned the Talmud. So we see all of these, and that effectively, that affected dramatically Jewish readings. So we have here basically a situation, this is a local situation with the dukes who are trying to affirm their power in the new capital. And on the other side, we have pressure from the local and the central church toward Ghettoization. What we have also is a society at this point that is a sort of society of refugees that who arrive from different parts. And here I'm referring to a new paradigm that Nicola Testra brought to the attention of the early modern historians in identifying the early modern period more as a start, more with the expulsion from 1492 in Spain, a first attempt to expel impure elements from a context, and then rather than the promulgation of the thesis by Luther. So here what we see this language of purgation and purity, and a sort of compromise by the dukes in establishing the ghetto. So that was exactly from the Counter-Reformation. But we also don't see at the same time the violent language of purification and pollution that characterize other cities such as Barcelona, Frankfurt, and Rome, where the Christian clergy were much more influential.
Yeah, so that comparative perspective leads me to my next question, which is, you mentioned Frankfurt and Barcelona and Rome. We know that scholars of Italian Jewish history have lavished a great deal of attention on cities, perhaps first and foremost on Venice, but also Rome and Livorno and Trieste and Mantua and others. And so you've hinted at this at various points, but now you have the opportunity to tell us, what was it about Modena that really attracted your attention? What was distinctive about it in sort of the larger history of early modern Italian Jewry?
I would say that, and I remember when you wrote in your introduction to the volume on Italia Corporation and Seclusion, how you emphasize that there are sometimes we should consider that all of these cities that you mention were a constellation of different social and cultural microcosms. But on the other end, you were pushing us in thinking about also finding broad themes. So what I would say here that is particular and at the same time particular about Jews in Modena, the Jewish mercantile elite, and also something that can be found not only in Italy, but also in the early modern Jewry in general, I would say is surely this longevity of the mercantile elite and their presence. They were merchants at the periphery of the grand routes, trading routes that, for example, Francesca Trivellato described in her book, The Familiarity of Strangers. So these Jewish merchants were at the periphery of this mercantilistic world. At the same time, they invested in the city. They were not moving from a city to another city, but they were becoming Italian in this city. So this is one aspect of particularity, and also the fact that the sources were completely unexplored, and they can give you the possibility to do this kind of historical and societal investigation. Another side, though, is also the idea of how these Jewish merchants contributed to culture. They shaped Judaism. And here we can see, so for example, what for me was interesting is looking at how male and female Jewish identities were constantly controlled by internal cultural development, Lurianic and Cordoverian Kabbalah, both liturgical and non-devotional Hebrew poetry, and Sabbatianism. And also with Jewish-Christian interaction that, in addition to the daily life, included also Jesuits, converts, and inquisitors. So here, what I see here is is the coexistence of all of these different cultural and social elements that we can trace in other cities. So for example, also Venice was an important center for a Kabbalistic production, and but in Modena, you have the merchants who are shaping the Kabbalah, who are shaping Sabbatianism, and men and women. So what I would say here is the coexistence of all of these components that we can trace, or female agency that we can find also in Hamburg and Altona with different nuances. But at the same time, here all of these elements coexisted, and perhaps I would say that was is the most interesting aspect about this Jewish mercantile elite.
Right, and the result is a really rich and beautifully written microhistory of Modena that captures all of these elements that you mentioned, merchants, and you have some really wonderful discussions of physical space, gender, as we will discuss later, book history, all elements within this. And a really interesting question, I think, for those listening is what sources did you make use of in compiling this very rich microhistory?
So what I ended up in Modena because I was doing my master dissertation, then PhD dissertation on a collection of Judaica, specifically silver objects, rimonim and atarot, finials and crowns from the 17th and 18th century. And the collection in Modena, along with other cities, but in Modena is particularly extraordinary and well preserved. And while studying the honors of these collections, I found a family archive of the Formigini family. Nobody ever touched it. The Formigini are more famous for an editor who was quite known in Italy, and in 1938, in the aftermath of the promulgation of the racial laws, committed suicide in Modena. But this discovery then channeled different kinds of discoveries of state, inquisitorial, Jewish communities, other private archives scattered in Italy, Israel, and also in the United States. For example, at the UCLA Special Collection, there are a collection of letters of Abraham Rovigo, and one of my most famous Jewish merchants and Sabbatian represented. So what I was doing with the sources was, on the one hand, I was trying to bring together the best traditions of scholarship I know, and I noted that often American and Israeli scholars tend to work on Hebrew sources and to privilege intellectual and cultural history, while Italian or in general, or general historians privilege Latin and Italian sources, community records, notarial and inquisitorial records, and are more focused on the relations between the Jewish and the Christian societies. So what I wanted to do as a social historian was having a perspective of social history on this Jewish mercantile elite, bringing together Hebrew, Italian, and Latin sources in order to have a full picture of internal and external elements within the society. And also, I would say that, as you mentioned, the microhistory. So some discoveries I made, such as a library of a merchant, or a Pinchas, a register of a Jewish female confraternity, were what, according to Italian microhistorians, such as, for example, Edoardo Grandi, defined exceptional evidence, meaning extraordinary, out of normal. That this evidence, if properly contextualized in the light of the historical context and and other sources, can actually not just illuminate a micro phenomenon, but also macro phenomena and addressing broad questions. That is what I try to do with the sources and my discoveries.
Right. And one of the central actors, as it were, in any reconstruction of early modern Italian Jewish history is the institution of the ghetto, first introduced in Venice in 1516 and in Modena more than a century later. And as you know very well, scholars have differed in understanding the import of the ghetto, its meaning in Italian Jewish life. Some have seen it as a purely punitive instrument imposed by Christian society upon Jews as a means of segregation and constraint. Others tend to see it in more complex terms, in part as a means of physical protection for the Jews, or as far less closed than others have posited, as more porous than others have posited, and therefore allowing for kind of two-way exchange, a multi-directional exchange of cultural values. I'm wondering what your general theory and then precise historical picture of the ghetto of Modena is in light of these very interesting historiographical debates.
Yeah, David, thank you. Thank you for this question, because as you envision, I spend a lot of time on thinking about the role of ghettoization and the ghetto as both a metaphor and a reality that characterize Italian Jews. And basically, if you think about when Francesca Trivelato was mentioning this, was shaping this category of communitarian cosmopolitanism, thinking about societies of merchants that in any case are shaped and constrained by rigid separation and anti-Semitism as well. And she was referring to Livorno and other port cities. You can even imagine when we have the imposition of ghettos. What I think is that if we think about the debate between, in particular, Roberto Bonfil, who was basically giving a sort of positive image of the ghetto in terms of fixing the presence of Jews in Italy, versus David Ruderman, who's in any case emphasizing the wealth and the rich opportunities of exchange between Jews and non-Jews and the creativity, we can, in a way, see some differences here. I also think that then something happened, and scholars like David Ruderman shaped the concept of the early modern period that is a concept that has animated Jewish historians in the last 20 years. So I think that here, looking respectively, what I see is that, and if we want to add Kenneth Stowe also to the debate and this concept of acculturation, the three of them were basically shaping the study of Jews in Italy. And we can use the word of active participation that Robert Bonfil used, or negotiation that David Ruderman used, or acculturation that Kenneth Stowe used. But at the end of the day, the three of them were recognizing that the ghetto was a compulsory residence that was meant to separate Jews and Christians, and also, as you mentioned, for example, in your introduction, also with in some context, for example, Florence, with also an intent of humiliation and dishonor. But that said, I think also that if we look at in the context of the early modern period, and we go beyond this idea of Renaissance and Baroque, we also see that instead, besides this intent and the visible construction and the church politics that are always there. So this early modern world was not that as porous as sometimes Mediterranean historians envision, and as Francesca Trivellato or Subrahamian emphasize. So the polity of the church is there, but nevertheless, these were interesting enclaves in the early modern world. And in Modena, for example, the ghetto was the only enclave where you can see a cosmopolitan city and different parts of the Jewish community expressing different values in different languages and through different educational systems. What I found very interesting in my work was thinking about the ghetto as basically a compromise. So it was a sort of transvesting the city. So there is the ghetto. We assure you that there is protection from the Jewish pollution, but then in the reality, Jews are everywhere. On the other side, what I also think that is important is also this, I try to work with what early modern historians like Guido Ruggiero or Edward Muir, for example, are doing with anthropology, and the idea of the concept of a planning city that in Italy, according to general historians, rightly enough, was always unsuccessful. But actually, if you look at the Ghetto of Modena, it was built and shaped by this mercantile elite and negotiated at any stage. That was, and also was perceived with words and emotion, that was a planned, successful community. And also the fact that then the Ghetto allows you to explore the Ghetto of Modena, different concept of eruv, different context of purity and pollution, looking at the pollution from outside, the concept of impurity inside. So all of this kind of microcosm, I think in terms of approach is possible if we look at Jews in Italy as a Jewish community in the early modern world.
Right. Now, one of the most interesting ways to sort of explore the permeability or lack thereof of the boundary that separates Jews from Christians in Italian society is through an examination of the books that Jews held. And one of the really most interesting sets of discussions in your book is your discussion of the libraries of some of your central merchant protagonists. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the book history of Modenese Jewry, especially the collection, the Library of Modena. What does that reveal to us?
Moise Modena was a Jewish affluent merchant and banker. He was tried by he never left any orthographical work. He was a cultured man, but he was not a scholar. His son, Aaron Berechia Modena, was a scholar and a Kabbalist. His work, Mavaria book, Revolution, funerary rituals in Central and Eastern Europe, and but Moise Modena was more connected to book reading and collecting a library. I just, because again, I want just to give some context here, often Jews from Italian Jews were taking the names from the city where they settled in. So Moise Modena in Modena, I know that it doesn't help, but that is what happened with this family that moved from Provence.
There's a more famous figure who bears that name as well, whom you might mention at some point.
Leone Modena, who's the cousin of this Moise Modena. So what happened here in the context I described before, the inquisitors targeted Jewish affluent families, and they used them as basically, and they shaped the strategies of going after, if we can use this expression, them in order to push toward the ghettoization on the one hand, and also extort money through fees in change of condemnations. Here what we have is in 1600, Moise Modena was tried by the Inquisition for owning non-Hebrew, not yet censored books, such as a book by Raimondo Lull, a Bible in Spanish, meaning in the vernacular, that was prohibited after the 1596, Boccaccio's Decameron. And what happens here is that Moise was obliged by the Inquisitor to go back and forth from different lists of his books, and in the end he surrendered all of his books. So I analyze his book, his story, the writings of his children too. Another rabbi was active and was son of Moise at the time, different kind of sources, and I consider this documentation the only really reliable documentation about a complete library we have. Others, I use many other sources, but this is a complete library, and is impressive, consisting mostly of Hebrew, Italian, and Latin books, range from Rashi's biblical commentaries to Sefer HaKutzari, Meorei 9, from Petrarch to Marsilio Ficino. It included legal codes in Hebrew, Hebrew grammars, medical codes, midrashim, and also books in Italian and Latin literature, rhetoric, medicine, and philosophy. So here we again. So and I know that I reconstructed that in this library that was in the same building of Modena's synagogue and school. Jewish merchants, teachers, men and women were using the books there. So for me, what here was interesting is looking at, here we have a combination of culture and commerce, and often sources allow us to explore the culture of authors, but not the world of Jewish merchants. And here, what I see here that we know through early modern, from historians of early modern Jewry, that the intellectual words of Italian and other Mediterranean Jewish author was based on disciplines such as Kabbalah, rhetoric, historiography, scholastic, Neoplatonic philosophy, magic, medicine, the science and music. Here, what we discover is that this world was shared beyond the intellectual elite, and this world was shaped by Jewish merchants.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, to call attention to this intellectual and cultural diversity, and to see the central role of merchants as purveyors of this diversity, so fascinating. And really, one of the most interesting elements of the internal diversity of the community was the presence of Sephardic Italian and Ashkenazic Jews. I was always struck by the fact that one of the most prominent Ashkenazi families was, I believe, the Sanguinetti family. Not a typical Ashkenazi name. I wonder if you could just say a brief word about the interrelations amongst these various sub-communities within the Modena Jewish world.
Yes, also because, thank you, because also this is also an important element of the book compared to other contexts in Italy and elsewhere. What we see here, for example, the Modenas and the Sanguinettis were two families were antagonizing at the end of the 16th century. The Sanguinettis arrived in the middle of the 16th century. Basically, they were interfering in the monopolies of credit activities run by the Modenas. Then both in the aftermath of 1598 and the inquisitorial attacks and the pressure by the dukes and the corporations in general, instead of dividing, they were more and more associating with each other, and they basically became together the first lay leaders, formalizing their roles of the Jewish community, and they helped transitioning the entire Jewish community into ghettoization. What is interesting is that here, again, compared to other contexts, all of these different components assimilated, in this case, I can say assimilated in Italian Jewry. So basically what we have is a sort of amalgamation with minimal frictions of different communities. And it's also interesting, though, to see how, for example, Sephardic Jews had a Bible in the vernacular in Spanish, and the Sanguinetti had prayer books in Yiddish and translations in Yiddish. And in the case of biblical translations into Yiddish, both were under the scrutiny of the Inquisition, because actually one of the main aspect of this index of prohibited books that actually affected history of Catholicism was the prohibition of having any Bible in any vernacular language. So it could be, you can have as a Jew a Bible in Hebrew, but not in Spanish or in Yiddish. Same for a parallel for Catholic for Christian Catholic, they could have only Bibles in Latin. So that is the idea of keeping the customs, and at the same time, these families, compared to other Jewish communities, for example, in Germany, kept their family synagogues. Their family synagogues remain the main centers for all the different Jewish communities in the city.
Yes, I mean, you have leading families who own synagogues. a sort of a different model than what we think of typically as the
Exactly.
synagogue as the property of the entire community.
Exactly. Exactly.
So one of the most interesting features, another just extremely interesting feature of the book is the gender history piece of it. And there are various pieces of that that perhaps we can spend a little bit of time on. Most of our attention has been focused on male merchants who are central protagonists in your story. And you discuss the phenomenon of masculinization in talking about them. I wonder if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, and this is also connected to what we just discussed. So the idea of the consolidation of this mercantile, male-centered elite, as I've seen it, this process implied a masculinization of the public sphere and a sort of, or better, the public domain, and also a sort of attempt of confining women to the domestic sphere and limiting also, for example, their access to secular culture by urging them in a sort of cloistered bibliotheca selecta. And for example, women were encouraged to read the translation of the Seder Mitzvot Nashim into Italian, and they were Italian women particularly encouraged to read this book with the Jewish precepts specifically for women, rather than Boccaccio's Decameron and Orlando's Furioso. If we look at Modena in particular, we see also, and this is an element that Elliot Horowitz, an excellent historian of early modern Jewry, brought to our attention years ago, the idea of this influenced by the Counter-Reformation in limiting a popular expression in the Jewish society. What is interesting for me here is that looking particularly at this rabbi, Aaron Berechia Modena, is that he was a particular Kabbalist who definitely reimagined the reality of women into the domestic space. But what is interesting here that in this process of masculinization, he was also conceiving new options for women. So this kind of process implied also some sophistication and the space for women that often is neglected by Jewish historians or general historians. So there was this idea of, for example, creating a space for women that was under control, but this space also was reached with the creation of new prayers, for example, for women, or attempts to give new rituals, for example, holding candles during childbirth, in order to contrast the custom that Jewish women in Modena have, and not only in Modena, of holding a Torah scroll during the childbirth. So here is one aspect. And on the other, the father then, through discovery and studying, I think one of the main point of this story is to tell us that this idea of the domestic and the public within the Jewish household is a sort of artificial creation that as historians made sometimes, and I understand why, but actually here the spaces were much more confused, and we see women in spaces that were not according to prescriptive literature for women, such as, or readings that were not for women. So we find the wife of a rabbi who owned the Cameron and Ovid's book in her closet in her room, and the inquisitor discovered them. So here we see also sort of new revision of female readings and the opportunity that women had in terms of culture. In my opinion, what happens here is that women were basically constrained in a sort of bibliotheca selecta for some aspect, were not encouraged to verse themselves in Jewish subjects, and they switched to secular culture, music, and literature in Latin, Italian, that was for them a sort of new active way to participate in the contemporary culture.
Right, an ironic effect, seemingly cutting against the grain of that original purpose of masculinizing the public sphere as a way of constraining women from doing precisely that. One of the interesting chapters in your book that demonstrates that women are far from passive actors alone, but possess agency of real intrigue and interest and force, is in the case of the Soled Cholim Chevra, or association, which participates in a larger culture of private associations or semi-public associations. Could you tell us a bit about the Soled Cholim Chevra?
Yes, absolutely. And for example, in this idea of confining the women into the domestic sphere, one of the actually successful consequences was that the confraternity in the Ghetto of Modena became almost an exclusive male affair till 1735, when women were creating the upper middle class, and Jewish women were creating this confraternity. And again, the idea is that being in the house doesn't mean to suppress creativity. So there was a confinement in the house, and the confraternity started in the house. So we see the main founder. So this confraternity was made with the intent of take care of all women, all sick women in the ghetto, poor and wealthy. The founders were Jewish women from this mercantile elite that actually were much more silent and passive in terms of, for example, their participation into the business of economic sphere, that lower classes women. Lower classes women remain active in the market, while upper middle class Jewish women disappear basically from any transaction, and often were, it seems quasi almost they were seen as passive subjects in shaping the basically matrimonial unions through different kinds of societies in different cities. So here what we have is these women, this community of women, they are, they have in common, coming from this mercantile elite, all of their families owned synagogues in the ghettos, and the Rovigos family in particular was the family more active in the Sabbatian movement. And this confraternity was established in the same building where this heretical center, a moderate accommodation to Sabbatianism, was created in the 1670s by Abraham, since the 1670s by Abraham Rovigo. So, for example, in this house, there was the organization of a ceremony, a festive ceremony for the for Tisha B'Av, thinking about the Messiah, the messianic expectations are realizing, so let's celebrate instead of fasting. So here what we have these women who were attracted, and also studies by Ada Rapoport Albert for Central and Eastern Europe confirm this attraction, but these were attracted to Sabbatianism, and surely the founder, Miriam, and his mother, Grazia, were influenced by this work. Nevertheless, this community of women was always quite conservative in their stand. They organized a confraternity that was taking care of various aspects of the welfare of the ghetto, not only taking care of sick women, but also organizing a series of activities that could stop conversionary pressure from outside the society and helping Jewish poor. So what we have here is basically these women who are in charge of different roles. After 10, they were considered as not anymore minor, so members or workers in the synagogues. I didn't find trace of a physician, while women were active in midwifery and gynecology. And what was denied to them in their families in terms of business transaction, these women realized through the confraternities with different business transactions with Christian entrepreneurs as well as Christian confraternities and Jewish confraternities. They also enacted a process of differentiation in terms of religious devotion with rituals for Rosh Chodesh, for the processions for the donation of dowries of girls. And then ultimately what they did was creating even a religious sphere, a proper religious sphere with a female synagogue. So here we have a sort of leaving the public sphere, going to the house, and from the house going back to the religious sphere, and again always without subverting the balance.
Right.
In the strata.
So at the end of the day, do you feel this upholds or shatters the separate spheres frame?
I think that in the end uphold because of their attitude. So was the idea also how every time they were presenting themselves and asking permissions from the male establishment, you see a strategy in order to, for example, ask 2 members of the male elite to help them in preparing their request. On the other side, what is interesting is that when in 1798, Miriam Rovigo left and after a few months died, the other members of the Jewish community, of the Jewish confraternity, asked the Kahal, the community council, to give them a room in the main center in the community, where also other confraternities, where the rabbinical tribunal was, and where other male confraternity had their houses, their rooms. And the request was promptly granted. So on the one hand, you can see that there was a recognition of their role. On the other side, better perhaps having these women in a Foucauldian strategy under our roof rather than in their house.
Right. So sort of straddling the line between more and less visible relative to earlier times. And this brings us to the 18th century and the late 18th century, to the point at which Jews are becoming less invisible and more visible under a new political regime, the Bonapartean regime. And one of the fascinating features of the book, and in some sense the coda to it, is your discussion of the discourse of one Moise Formigini in 1796, which brings us to the end of your subtitle, Emancipation. Could you set the stage and tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. And I remember that some years ago, I was a PhD student and I presented some part of this work. And you told me, Federica, if you think that you want to say something, say something. So what I said in this chapter is actually what I see here is a process of Jewish emancipation that was looking more at the French model in terms of a secular culture and legal culture and the encyclopédie, so the French Enlightenment, rather than the Prussian Askala, the German Jewish Enlightenment. And what we have here is also a practice of enlightenment shaped by merchants. And Moise Formigini was one of the most affluent merchants at the time. His family, I trace the story, started in Modena with the small activities in 1598, and then this word of the mercantility was not impermeable. So this family then became the most important family in the ghetto, and Modena was active also in preparing the arrival of Napoleon. So in 1796, on October 15, Napoleon is in the city, and Modena gives a speech that he wrote down in front of the government and in front of Napoleon. And what he asked is in sort of also another element that is distinct of this group of merchants and enlighteners who are becoming visible, and they want to be visible, is the fact that they were believing in the legal codes, in the French arrival, and they were also optimist. So they were, you don't see here, so he gives this speech that is a sort of summary and compendium of other speeches or talks and writings by Jewish rabbis and intellectuals in emphasizing how Jews can be useful and are successful in early modern societies. Here, so but often though, what was requested by these intellectuals was that actually Jews are content in being merchants, and they are the best fit of the absolute state because they don't want to become politicians. And here, what we have actually are some Jewish merchants who want to become visible. They want to enter into the political scene, and they want to become, quoting Moise Modena, who was quoting the encyclopedia, active citizens. So that is what is requesting. So in a way is anthologizing a lot of sources from Valabreg to Simon Luzzatto and others. On the other side, he was using this idea of commerce and usefulness of Jews in order to make them part of the societies and make them citizens. And then you see also in the speech he delivered also the elements of his idea of the legal, Jews need legal protection. Everything, all the concession to Jews have to happen according to the law. And important is also the idea of having a secular education. Important is also the fact of having fathers who control their families. So there is this mixture of old and new, yet Moise Formigini became the first Italian Jew elected in a parliament in the Cisalpine Republic under Napoleon, and then became a leader of Italian Jewry between the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. So in a way here you see the passage, as you mentioned, in a different social and legal order from invisible to visible.
So just as we have reached the point of visibility and legibility for the Jews of Modena, I want to ask you one final question that takes us back a little bit in time, but at the same time brings us up to the present as we mark almost to the day 2 years to the first lockdowns related to the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic. And what is germane here is that there was a plague in Modena in 1630, and perhaps others before and after, but you spend time talking about the 1630 plague. And I'm just wondering what you learned about the plague and how it was dealt with, and whether there are any lessons we can learn from what happened in Modena 400 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, David. When actually I was revising the manuscript exactly in the moment of the explosion of the pandemic, and I was revising the documents about the 1630 plague that were more meaningful than in other moments. So what I would say is, first of all, in terms of when we're mentioning the language of purgation and pollution, it was interesting here is there is, as always, this sort of compromise, and the idea of Jews who have to be confined in a particular lazaretto, a sort of area where all the people infected have had to live. And there was nearby a Christian lazaretto as well, but Jews were never targeted as agents of the plague in Modena. It didn't happen in 1630, didn't happen in 1557 as well. So this kind of language was absent. But what's interesting here is also, if we look at, for example, who is so separation and containment and precautions were important and are important. On the other side, also the fact that there are people who during the pandemic became extremely rich, there are people who became extremely poor, and there are people who died in silence without anybody around. And for example, when I always mention the concept of human being to my students, sometimes they look, think about or the plague in 1348 or in the early modern period or now, this idea of the dying by yourself, that while death is should be a defining moment of your life. So there are all of these elements here. And in terms of becoming rich, for example, the Duke of Modena was confiscating all the goods of Jews who died during the plague. So there is also this element of taking profit of from the dead. And then also, in the end, maybe is a wishful thinking, the virus disappeared and life started again. So that is, but the memory of that plague with all of these, with basically a third of the Jewish population who died at the time, sorry, a fourth, was still, was perpetuated in writings and prayers as well.
Well, there are some things we can learn from Modena and the plague in 1630, but there is a great deal we can learn from this book, Invisible Enlighteners, the Jewish Merchants of Modena, from the Renaissance to the Emancipation. I'm tempted to say, Federica, that you should pick up now with Formigini's Discorso and take this story into the 19th and 20th centuries. But we'll hope for that, and indeed maybe have an opportunity to have you back for a subsequent conversation in a few years. This has been really a wonderful and enriching conversation. It is a deeply researched and beautifully written book, and I extend my deep congratulations to you. It was a really engrossing and delightful read, and this was really a delightful conversation to have with you, my friend.
Thank you, as always.